It was the kind of night that made you feel like the city was holding its breath. The rain had been falling all day, steady and cold, turning Mulberry Street into a mirror of slick black stone and crooked yellow light. Neon signs buzzed above shuttered storefronts, their glow bleeding into puddles like spilled liquor. You could smell the mix: damp asphalt, cigarette smoke, wet wool coats, and something else, something electric in the air, the kind of thing you can't see but you feel in your teeth. Back then, the Lower East Side wasn't the picture postcard they sell to tourists now. It was alive, sure, but alive like a man with a fever. Tenements stacked on top of each other, windows glowing in the dark like watchful eyes. Voices in Sicilian, Neapolitan, Yiddish, English all drifting through the rain, blending with the muffled notes of a piano from some upstairs gin joint. This was my neighborhood. I knew every crack in the sidewalk, every shadow in the alley. And more importantly, I knew who owned them. They called me Charlie back then, Charlie lucky if they like me, just lucky if they didn't. I was 20-something, but I'd been in the game long enough to know how the streets talked. And that night, the streets were whispering about war. Not the kind you read about in the papers, not soldiers in uniforms. This was quieter, nastier. A war where you smiled at the guy you were planning to bury. The old men, the mustache Petes, they thought they still ran things. Guys like Giuseppe Masuria. The boss. Men who carried Sicily in their pockets like a coin they could flip whenever they needed to remind you who was in charge. They ran the rackets the old way, slow, cautious, never trusting anyone who wasn't born under the same sun they were. Me? I saw America for what it was: fast, hungry, and ready to take. If you moved slow, you starved. That night, I was leaning against the wall outside Sal's place, a little cafe that never closed, even during a police raid. Inside, a few guys were playing cards, the clink of chips and low mutter of voices cutting through the sound of the rain. I wasn't there for the game. I was there because a message had come down the grapevine, the kind you don't ignore. Someone wanted to meet. He showed up out of the fog, hat pulled low, coat collar turned up, Frankie Yale's man. I knew him by the way he walked, quick but careful, like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. He slid into the doorway, nodded once. "Masuria's losing patience," he said. "No small talk." Just like that. I didn't answer right away. You learn in this life that silence is a weapon. Let a man talk too much, he'll tell you more than he means to. The kid shifted on his feet, glanced down the street, then back at me. "He says you've been meeting with the wrong people." Now, I could have played dumb, acted like I didn't know what he meant. But the truth was, I had been meeting with the wrong people or the right people, depending on how you looked at it. Salvatore Maranzano's boys, mostly. They were new blood, too sick of the old guard. We spoke the same language, not Sicilian, not Neapolitan, but American. I took a slow drag of my cigarette, watched the tip glow red in the dark. "Tell Joe," I said, "I don't meet with anyone I don't want to meet." The kid blinked like he didn't know whether to laugh or run. Then he turned and disappeared back into the rain. Moments like that, you don't need a crystal ball to see where things are heading. The old ways were cracking, and once a crack starts, it never stops. I could feel the shift coming, like the way the air changes before a storm. And me? I wasn't about to be standing under a tree holding an umbrella when it hit. I lit another cigarette, turned up my collar, and walked. The city felt different that night. The street lamps flickered like they knew secrets, the shadows leaned in close. Somewhere, a saxophone moaned from behind a closed door, the sound spilling into the wet air like a confession. Every step I took echoed like the city was answering me. In the distance, I passed the old church, its bells silent. I thought about the sermons I'd heard as a kid about loyalty, honor, sin. Good words. Strong words. But out here, loyalty was just currency, honor was what you called it when you didn't get caught, and sin was just business. I reached the corner of Canal and Mulberry, leaned against a lamppost, and watched a black Packard roll slow through the rain. Inside, two silhouettes. They didn't look my way, but I knew who they were, Maranzano's boys. Just a nod from them as they passed. No words. But I understood. We were all moving pieces on the same board, and soon someone was gonna tip it over. The rain picked up, drumming harder on the awnings, washing the gutters clean for whatever was coming. I pulled my hat down low and kept walking, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the night. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard laughter, sharp, mean. Could have been nothing. Could have been everything. By the time I reached my apartment, the city was quiet again, like it had decided to keep its secrets for another day. But I knew better. New York never keeps a secret for long. It just waits until the right ears are listening. And I was always listening. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of traffic in the distance. My hands behind my head, cigarette burning in the ashtray beside me. I thought about Masuria. I thought about Maranzano. And I thought about me, caught between two kings, knowing only one could wear the crown. The funny thing about power? It's never about who deserves it. It's about who's willing to take it. And I was ready. The streets didn't know it yet, but the silence that night wasn't peace. It was just the pause before the first shot. They called M Mustache Pete's. Not to their faces, of course, unless you were looking to wind up in the East River with your shoes full of cement. It wasn't just about the whiskers. It was the way they clung to the old country like it was a life raft and America was just a storm to ride out. They dressed the same, ate the same, spoke the same language they did back in Sicily. And they never forgot where you were born. If you came into this world on American soil, you'd always be a half-breed to them. I used to watch Joe Masuria sit at the head of the table, chewing a cigar like it owed him money, his eyes half-closed but always sharp. He'd listen to a man talk for 20 minutes, then answer with one sentence, sometimes just a grunt. He liked control. He liked tradition. And he sure as hell liked being called the boss. Thing was, tradition didn't mean much when the world was moving faster than you could light a cigarette. Prohibition had turned every street in the city into a gold mine, and the smart guys were pulling more money in a week than the old men ever saw in their lives. But the Mustache Pete's, they still played by the same slow rules. Small crews. No outsiders. No expansion. That didn't work for me. I wanted bigger. I wanted the city. I wanted the whole country. And I wasn't the only one. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, guys I'd known since we were running errands for nickels, they felt the same. We were the new blood, and we didn't care if you spoke Sicilian or came from Palermo, New Jersey. All we cared about was whether you could make money and keep your mouth shut. I remember one night in the back room of a speakeasy on 52nd Street. The walls were lined with crates of Canadian whiskey, the good stuff, still smelling of pine from the boats. Costello leaned across the table, his voice low. "Joe's holding us back, Charlie," he said. "He's got his foot on the brake when we should be hitting the gas." I didn't answer right away. You never rush in these conversations. Instead, I poured us each a shot, let the silence do the work. Then I said, "We can't move forward unless someone moves him out of the way." The words hung in the air like cigar smoke. Nobody said yes, but nobody said no either. And in our world, silence was as good as a contract. Meanwhile, across town, Salvatore Maranzano was building his own empire. He had the same Sicilian blood as Masuria, but he was smarter about it. He studied history, read books about Julius Caesar, talked about discipline, strategy, the art of ruling. Some guys thought he was a little too full of himself. Me? I saw a man who understood that this wasn't just about muscle. This was about running a business. Still, a war was coming, and everybody knew it. The old guard wasn't going to hand over power just because a bunch of young Americanized punks asked nicely. We were going to have to take it. The first shots came quiet, a guy disappearing here, another found in a back alley there. Nothing that made the papers, but enough to send a message. Soon, the whispers started. Men looked over their shoulders more often. They checked under their cars before starting the engine. The city was holding its breath again, and I could feel it in my bones. One night, Masuria called me in. His office smelled like stale cigars and power. He sat behind the desk, fingers tapping slow against the wood. "Charlie," he said, "I hear things. Things about you and certain people I don't like." I kept my face blank. "I talk to a lot of people, Joe. It's business." His eyes narrowed. "Business is loyalty. You remember that?" I nodded, but inside I was already somewhere else. I knew right then that whatever loyalty I had left was on borrowed time. You can't build the future if you're chained to the past. When I left his office, the night air felt colder. The streets looked different, like they were already choosing sides. Some guys nodded when they saw me. Others looked away. And in this life, a man who won't meet your eyes might as well be pointing a gun at your back. Over the next few weeks, the meetings got smaller, quieter. Back rooms in bars that didn't exist on paper. Apartments with the curtains drawn. We talked about territory, about shipments, about who could be trusted when the shooting started. And always, the question was the same: who was gonna make the first move? One evening, I walked down Grand Street with Genovese. The sidewalks were crowded, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries. He stopped under a street lamp, lit a cigarette, and said, "It's not about winning, Charlie. It's about surviving long enough to be the last man standing." I looked at him and smiled. "Then let's make sure that man is one of us." That was the moment I knew there was no turning back. The lines had been drawn, even if the bullets hadn't started flying yet. The mustache Petes were holding onto a world that didn't exist anymore, and we were ready to build something new, something bigger, something better. But to do that, we'd have to burn down the old house. The rain started up again that night, just a light drizzle, but enough to blur the streetlights and make the cobblestones shine. I stood at my window, watching it fall, thinking about Masuria, about Maranzano, about the city itself. New York was like a woman who'd been with too many men, beautiful, dangerous, unpredictable. You could never really own her, but you could fight like hell to keep her for as long as she'd have you. And I was ready for that fight. Prohibition, that was the real gold rush. Not in California, not panning rivers for flecks of yellow, but right here in New York, where a man with the right connections and no conscience could turn water into whiskey and whiskey into more money than the banks could count. The Volstead Act might have been the law, but out here it was just an invitation. An invitation to get rich. And we answered it with both hands. See, liquor was more than a drink back then. It was an act of rebellion. People didn't go to speakeasies just for a gin fizz or a shot of rye, they went because it felt like sticking a thumb in the eye of the government. The rich, the poor, the politicians, the priests, they all wanted the same thing after dark: a drink in one hand, a secret in the other. And we were the ones who made it happen. I remember nights in the back of a long black sedan, headlights off, creeping down to the docks to meet a Canadian shipment. The crates would come off the boat smelling like pine and cold air, and the boys would hustle them into trucks before the dock rats even knew what was happening. Half of it went to the fancy joints uptown, champagne bars for the swells. The rest went to the neighborhood speakeasies, the kind where the bartender knew your name and your drink before you even sat down. Frank Costello handled a lot of the politics, keeping the cops and the judges happy with envelopes that got fatter every month. Vito Genovese liked the muscle side, making sure our shipments didn't get hijacked by some other crew looking to get cute. And me? I was the one in the middle, pulling the strings, making sure every glass poured in this city had our fingerprints on it. But liquor wasn't the only thing flowing in those days. Money brings women, and women bring trouble. I wasn't a saint. Never pretended to be. There were dames who liked the danger, the shine of a man who could walk into any joint and have the best table waiting. They'd dance close, whisper promises, and sometimes those promises turned into problems: a jealous husband here, an ambitious showgirl there. You learned to smile, to flatter, to keep the peace until you didn't have to anymore. The streets were alive every night, music spilling out of clubs, cab tires hissing on wet pavement, the smell of roasting chestnuts mixing with perfume and cigar smoke. But under it all, there was a pulse. You could feel it in the walls, in the way men looked at each other too long, in the quiet that came right before the sound of a gunshot. Because make no mistake, Prohibition was a war. A war without battlefields, without uniforms, but with plenty of casualties. Every truckload of whiskey was a target. Every bar was a fortress that could be raided. And every handshake could be the start of a double cross. One night, we got word that one of our trucks headed up from the docks had gone missing. Just vanished. That kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. I gathered a few of the boys and we went looking. Found the truck an hour later, parked in a warehouse in Red Hook, 2 of our guys laid out cold on the floor. Still breathing, but just barely. The crates were gone. I knew who did it, or at least who ordered it. Bugsy Siegel had been sniffing around our routes, looking for a way in. I liked Bugsy, in the way you like a man you know you might have to kill someday. He was smart, fearless, and just reckless enough to make him dangerous. I didn't go after him right away. That's the thing about this life, timing is everything. You hit too soon, you look desperate. You wait too long, you look weak. I waited just long enough for him to think he'd gotten away with it. Then one night, his guys found one of their own hanging upside down in a meat locker, a bottle of our best whiskey smashed on the floor beside him. The message was clear: take what's ours and you won't live to drink it. After that, the hijacking stopped, at least for a while. But the real danger wasn't from the streets, it was from the men in suits sitting in offices uptown, reading the same headlines everyone else ignored. Politicians had started to notice just how much money was changing hands, and they wanted their cut. We gave it to them, of course. Easier to buy a man than to bury him. But the more they took, the more they wanted. And the more they wanted, the more heat came down from Washington. It was around this time I started hearing more about Maranzano. He was running liquor just like the rest of us, but he had this air of legitimacy, like he was a businessman who just happened to be in an illegal business. He talked about efficiency, about streamlining operations, about dividing the city like a pie so everyone got their fair slice. On paper, it sounded smart. In reality, it was just another kind of control. Still, I kept the lines open. In this business, you talk to everyone because you never know who's going to be standing next to you when the bullets start flying. And the way things were going, bullets were coming. The newspapers loved to write about gangland murders, bootlegger slain in Brooklyn, or mob war erupts over liquor rout. They made it sound like some kind of exotic crime wave, like we were pirates in fedoras. But for us, it was just Tuesday. You woke up, checked if your friends were still alive, and went to work. Simple as that. I'll tell you something, I never cared about being the meanest or the loudest. I cared about being the last one in the room when everyone else was gone. And Prohibition? Prohibition was thinning the room fast. The guys who couldn't handle the pressure, who got greedy or sloppy, they disappeared quick. The survivors were the ones who could smile at a man while they were figuring out the best place to put the bullet. By the end of 29, the money was pouring in like water. We had judges drinking our booze, cops dancing in our clubs, and politicians making speeches about law and order while their pockets bulged with our cash. On the surface, it looked like we were untouchable. But I'd been around long enough to know that when you're sitting at the top, that's when the climb starts to feel shaky. The old men were getting restless, the young guns were getting ambitious, and the city was starting to feel like a powder keg. One spark and everything would go up. And the funny thing about sparks? You never see them coming until it's too late. It started with a bullet in the dark. Not the first one I'd ever heard, and not the last, but this one lit the fuse. They called it the Castellammarese War later on, made it sound like something out of the history books. But for those of us living it, it wasn't history. It was the air we breathed. It was the reason we didn't walk down the same street twice in a week. It was the reason you kissed your mother a little longer before you left the house. The first body was a low-level soldier out of Brooklyn, one of Masuria's boys. Found face down in the gutter, rainwater pooling around him, a dark halo spreading slow from under his head. No witnesses. No suspects. But everyone knew it was Maranzano's people. It was their style, quick, clean, no message except the body itself. Masuria didn't wait long to answer. 3 nights later, a bar in Little Italy went quiet when 2 men walked in wearing long coats and dead eyes. They didn't say a word. Just walked up to the table where one of Maranzano's captains was drinking espresso and put 2 rounds into his chest before walking back out into the night. The espresso was still steaming when the cops showed up. After that, the streets stopped pretending. Everyone picked a side, whether they wanted to or not. Shopkeepers, bartenders, cab drivers, you were either Masuria or Maranzano, and if you said you were neither, someone would decide for you. I kept my head down, played both sides just enough to keep breathing. On the surface, I was still loyal to Joe. But behind closed doors, I was listening to Maranzano, nodding at the right words, filing away every promise he made. A man in my position couldn't afford to be sentimental. The hits kept coming. Drive-bys in the early hours, bodies found in the trunks of stolen cars, whole poker games wiped out by shotgun blasts through the window. The papers called it a gang war. We called it Tuesday. And through it all, the cops kept their distance, too afraid or too well paid to do anything but chalk the bodies and move along. One night, I met with Vito Genovese in a cramped apartment above a bakery. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread, almost enough to cover the tension. He closed the blinds, locked the door, and poured 2 glasses of red wine. "Charlie," he said, "this can't go on. Sooner or later, one side's gotta win. And if it's Joe, we'll be stuck in the old ways forever." I swirled the wine, watching the deep red cling to the glass. "You saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying," Vito replied, "maybe it's time to start thinking about who should be sitting in the big chair when the dust settles." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew where this was heading. The thing about a war like this is it doesn't just kill men, it kills business. Bootlegging routes were getting hijacked, shipments were disappearing, and the customers didn't care which side you were on, they just wanted their drink. The longer the war went, the more money we all lost. And losing money was the one thing nobody could stomach. I played the diplomat when I had to. Sat in smoky backrooms with Maranzano's lieutenants, shaking hands, smiling like we weren't already planning each other's funerals. Then I'd go to Joe's place and nod along while he ranted about the honor of the old ways, the betrayal of young men who'd forgotten their roots. But inside, I was making a list. Not of enemies, those were obvious. I was making a list of survivors. Men who could adapt, who could see past the next payday. Because when the war ended, and it would end, I wanted to be surrounded by men who were thinking about the next 10 years, not the last 10. The violence hit closer one cold February night. I was leaving a club in Hell's Kitchen when a black sedan screeched around the corner. 2 men leaned out, Thompsons in hand, and sprayed the sidewalk. Bullets tore into the brick behind me, glass shattered, people screamed. I hit the ground, rolled behind a parked truck, and didn't move until the sound of the engine faded. When I stood up, the doorman was lying on the ground, eyes wide, a neat hole in his forehead. Wrong place, wrong time. That's how it went. You could be making a living just opening doors for people and still end up a casualty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Sat by the window with a bottle of rye, watching the city lights blink in the distance. Somewhere out there, the men who pulled those triggers were probably laughing over their drinks, thinking they'd scared me. But they'd done the opposite. They'd made me certain of what needed to happen. The war was burning everything down, and the only way to stop it was to take the match out of both men's hands. Joe was too stubborn to change. Salvatore was too ambitious to share power. That left me, the man in the middle, the one they both underestimated. The next few weeks, I started planting seeds. Whispering to Joe's men about how much smoother things could run without Maranzano's interference. Telling Salvatore's boys how much easier life would be without Joe dragging the old country into every decision. It wasn't hard. When men are tired of fighting, they'll listen to any promise of peace. But peace wasn't my goal. My goal was control. And to get it, I'd need both of them out of the way. One evening, sitting in a dark corner of a cafe on Mulberry Street, I overheard two old-timers talking about the war. One said, "It can't last. The city's too small for two kings." The other shook his head and said, "Two kings? Nah. This city's big enough for one emperor." I smiled into my coffee. Maybe they didn't know it, but they just summed up my whole plan. The war dragged on for months. Men disappeared, businesses folded, and the funeral homes made more money than anyone else. But under all the blood and smoke, my plan was taking shape. I was still standing, still smiling, still shaking hands with both sides. And every day, I got a little closer to making my move. Because the truth was, the Castellammarese War wasn't about honor or revenge. It was about the future. And the future belonged to the man who could see past the war and into what came after. I could see it clear as day. And I intended to be that man. It was late March when the opportunity finally walked through my door. Joe called me personally, which he didn't do often, and told me we were having dinner. Not at his usual spot, not with the whole crew, but just him and me. Said he wanted to talk about the future. I almost laughed. If he knew what I had in mind for his future, he wouldn't have invited me at all. We met at a small restaurant in Coney Island, one of those quiet places where the owners know when to keep the wine flowing and their mouths shut. The smell of garlic and simmering tomato sauce hung in the air, and the only sound was the clink of silverware and the soft hum of a radio in the corner. Joe was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. Old habit. He gave me that big grin he used when he wanted to seem like everybody's uncle, but his eyes were sharp, measuring me. "Charlie," he said, waving me over. Sit. We got a lot to talk about." I took my seat, nodded at the waiter, and Joe immediately launched into a speech about loyalty. He talked about the old country, about how men today didn't understand respect, how too many were chasing dollars instead of honor. I let him talk. That was Joe's weakness, he loved the sound of his own voice. While he talked, I sipped my wine and thought about the men I'd spoken to in the last few weeks. Men who were tired. Men who would follow whoever ended the war. At one point, Joe leaned in, lowering his voice. "Charlie, you and me, we're not like these other guys. We understand what it takes to run things. We could finish this together. But first," he paused, stabbed his fork into a piece of sausage. "First we gotta take out Maranzano. Then the city's ours." I nodded slowly, hiding the twist of a smile. In Joe's mind, it was that simple, kill one man, take the throne. But he didn't see that while he was planning Salvatore's funeral, I was planning his. The food came, plates of pasta, meatballs, fresh bread. We ate, drank, and he kept talking. The more wine he drank, the more relaxed he got. I kept my glass half full, enough to keep him from noticing I wasn't matching him drink for drink. I needed a clear head. Halfway through the meal, he leaned back, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Charlie, I trust you. You know that, right? You're like a son to me." He said it with such conviction you'd think he meant it. Maybe a part of him did. But in this business, trust was just another word for leverage. I told him I'd handle it. That I'd set up the meeting with the right men make sure everything was in place to get Maranzano out of the picture. He seemed satisfied with that. He didn't ask too many questions. He never did when he thought he was the one holding the cards. We finished dinner and he lit a cigar, leaning back in his chair like a man who believed he was untouchable. The smoke curled in the dim light, wrapping around his face like a crown. I remember thinking how strange it was how a man could sit there so sure of his power while the ground beneath him was already crumbling. When we parted ways outside, the night air was sharp with the scent of the ocean. He slapped me on the shoulder, told me to call him in a few days. I promised I would. And as I watched him walk away, coat collar turned up against the wind, I knew I'd just shaken hands with a dead man. The next 48 hours were a blur of phone calls, whispered conversations, and quiet arrangements. I spoke to men who'd fought for Joe, for Salvatore, for nobody but themselves. Money changed hands, favors were promised, and by the time the sun set on the second day, the plan was set. We'd meet at a little place in Coney Island again, different restaurant, same quiet atmosphere. Joe thought it was another strategy session. What he didn't know was that the men waiting there weren't his friends. The morning of the meeting, I took a long walk through the city. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I stopped for coffee, watched the people hurrying past, shopkeepers opening their stores, kids running to school, newsboys shouting headlines about another shooting in Little Italy. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Nobody knew the war was about to change forever. I showed up late on purpose. Joe hated waiting, but I wanted him restless, off balance. When I walked in, he was already at the table, tapping his fingers, a half-empty glass of wine in front of him. I greeted him with a smile, sat down, and for a few minutes we talked like nothing was wrong. Then the door opened. 4 men stepped inside. They didn't say a word. I saw the flash of recognition in Joe's eyes the moment he understood. His hand went for his jacket, but it was too late. The sound of gunfire filled the room, shattering the quiet. Joe slumped forward, his cigar falling to the floor. It was over in seconds. The men left as quickly as they'd come, and I sat there staring at the body of the man who'd once been the king of New York. The war wasn't over yet, but the board had changed. And I was the one still standing. The city didn't stop for Joe's death. That's the thing about New York, you could put a bullet in a man at breakfast, and by lunchtime the streets would be full again, traffic horns blaring, people yelling about the price of fish. The blood dries, the chairs get put back, and life goes on. But in the alleys, in the back rooms, in the smoke-filled bars where the real decisions are made, everyone felt the shift. News traveled fast, though not in the way the papers told it. The headlines would call it another gangland hit, blame it on the Irish or some stray vendetta. But the men who mattered knew exactly what it meant. Joe was gone, and that left one man with the power to claim the crown, Salvatore Maranzano. I went to see him 2 nights later. His office wasn't really an office, more like a private apartment above a restaurant he owned. The place smelled of cigars and old wood. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the desk where he sat, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first apartment. He didn't get up when I walked in, just gave me the look, the one that measured a man's worth in a second. "Charlie," he said, his accent still thick with Sicily. "So Joe is gone." It wasn't a question. I told him the truth, at least the version he wanted to hear. That it was chaos, that nobody knew who pulled the trigger, that the streets were restless. He listened, nodding slowly like a priest hearing confession. "You did the right thing coming to me," he finally said. "We must bring order. This war, it has gone on too long. We are businessmen, not animals." That was Maranzano's charm, he made murder sound like management. He poured me a drink, spoke about building something new, something structured. He talked about capos and soldiers like it was a proper army. No more freelance hits, no more street wars. Every man would have a place, every family a seat at the table. And I'll admit, part of me liked the sound of it. The chaos had bled us all dry. But there was something in his voice, something sharp under the silk. This wasn't about peace. It was about control. He made it clear he wanted me with him. Not just as an ally, but as his right hand. He said my influence in the streets, my connections with both the young blood and the old guard, made me valuable. You are the bridge, he told me. You connect the past and the future. I smiled, shook his hand, and agreed. But even then, I knew the bridge he was talking about could just as easily become a plank over a pit. After that meeting, I started moving in his circles. His men were different from Joe's, quieter, more disciplined, but also more afraid. They followed orders like soldiers, and every order came from him. Maranzano ran his empire like a Roman general, and he wanted everyone to know it. Within weeks, he had the city divided like a map. 5 families, each with its own territory, each answering to him. He called it the Commission, though in those early days it was more like a council of war. On the surface, it looked like progress, no more all-out street battles, no more random bloodshed. But behind closed doors, the power plays were already starting. I watched him closely. He was a master at making men feel like they mattered, then using them up until they didn't. He'd invite you to dinner, laugh with you, toast your health, and by morning, you might be found in the trunk of a car. The more I saw, the more I realized something. Maranzano might have ended the war, but he was setting the stage for another one. He wanted absolute control, and he didn't trust anyone, not even me. One night, after a meeting at his apartment, he pulled me aside. "Charlie," he said quietly, "there are men who still have loyalty to Joe. I want you to watch them. If they step out of line, you tell me." I nodded. It was a simple request, but it told me everything I needed to know. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a tool, and tools can be replaced. Walking home that night, the city felt different. The lights seemed harsher, the shadows deeper. I'd helped put Maranzano on that throne, but I could already feel him tightening the chains. And I knew, sooner or later, one of us was going to have to go. It started small. A look here, a whisper there. You get to a certain point in this life and you don't need someone to say they want you gone, you can feel it in the air. Maranzano's men began watching me a little too closely, their eyes following me across the room. The conversations I used to be a part of now went quiet when I walked in. The handshakes felt colder, shorter. It wasn't paranoia. I'd seen this pattern before, the quiet isolation before the knife in the back. Maranzano was trimming the garden, cutting away anything that could grow too tall in his shadow. And I was a tree with roots too deep to pull up without breaking the soil. That made me dangerous. One night, Vito, one of my oldest friends, came to see me. We sat in the back of a speakeasy, the hum of conversation around us like static. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Charlie, you got people inside telling me Maranzano's bringing in guys from out of town. Sicilians. Real old country loyalists. They're not here for business. They're here for you." I didn't flinch. In this game, you can't let the fear show. But inside, I felt the slow, cold burn of certainty. Maranzano wasn't just tightening the leash, he was sharpening the blade. I went home that night and sat in the dark for hours, listening to the city outside my window. Cars rumbling over wet pavement. A saxophone playing somewhere in the distance. A man yelling in the street, then the echo of footsteps fading away. New York, in all its restless noise, felt quieter than it should. That's when I made the decision. If he was planning to take me out, I wasn't going to wait for the bullet. I'd seen too many men think they could talk their way out, make peace, negotiate. They all ended up in the ground. In this life, you don't survive by being lucky, you survive by moving first. The first step was finding out exactly who Maranzano trusted. He had this habit of surrounding himself with men who'd never dare challenge him, but loyalty bought with fear is fragile. I started sending out feelers, quiet questions through trusted channels. Who's unhappy? Who's getting cut out of deals? Who's hungry enough to risk everything? Within a week, I had names. Not many, but enough. And one of them was Big Meyer. Smart kid, all brains, no muscle, but the kind of guy who could turn an idea into a fortune. He and I had worked together before, and I knew he hated the old world way of doing things. Maranzano's obsession with being some kind of Roman emperor didn't sit right with him. I met Meyer in the back room of a tailor shop. We talked low, every word weighed like gold. I didn't lay it all out, not yet. You never open the whole hand until you know the other guy's holding something too. But I hinted. Said there were changes coming and that we needed to be ready when they did. Meyer just nodded. You're not the only one who sees it, Charlie. The old man's not gonna last. Question is, who replaces him? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because in this world, saying it out loud is the same as signing the contract. The second step was timing. Move too soon and you look like the aggressor. Wait too long and you're dead. Maranzano was planning a big meeting with the heads of the families. On paper, it was to finalize the structure of the commission. In reality, it was the perfect setup for him to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat, including me. Vito confirmed it 2 nights before the meeting. They're gonna hit you at the start, he said, his eyes hard. Quick, clean, no mess. You won't see it coming. But I saw it now. Clear as day. And in that moment, I stopped thinking of it as survival. This wasn't about me walking away alive. This was about ending Maranzano's reign before it buried us all. The plan started forming right there. Not wild, not rushed, precise, like a surgeon's cut. I wasn't going to confront him, shout accusations, or try to turn his men in the open. No. This would be quiet, surgical, and final. And if I pulled it off, the city wouldn't just remember me as Lucky Luciano. They'd remember me as the man who rewrote the rules. The thing about planning a hit on a man like Maranzano is you can't just rely on muscle. You need brains, patience, and a stomach for what's coming. This wasn't some street corner debt collection, this was toppling the so-called boss of bosses. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and the whole city would close in on me before the gun smoke even cleared. I started with the quiet part, identifying the players who could be trusted, not because they loved me, but because they hated him more. Meyer was already in. Then came Bugsy. Benjamin Siegel wasn't a man you sent to charm a crowd, he was a man you sent when you needed someone to disappear. He was quick, unpredictable, dangerous, the kind of guy who could turn a meeting into a bloodbath in less than a second. But under that wild streak, he had a code. If you were his friend, he'd walk through hell for you. We met late, long after the city had gone to bed, in the back of an all-night diner that smelled like burnt coffee and fried onions. Bugsy leaned back in the booth, chewing on a toothpick, his eyes never leaving mine. If we're doing this, Charlie, we do it clean. No amateurs. No witnesses. We go in, we get out, nobody knows we were there. I nodded. Clean. And we do it before he does it to us. The next step was getting inside Maranzano's world without tipping him off. That meant finding someone close to him, close enough to know his habits, the way he moved, the way he thought. We got lucky. One of his so-called trusted aides had a cousin who owed me money and wasn't too keen on paying it back. A little pressure, a little promise, and suddenly we had a direct line to the old man's schedule. He liked his meetings private, in his office above a Park Avenue building. Big windows, heavy drapes, a desk like something out of a museum. Every Thursday afternoon, like clockwork, he'd sit down with his advisors and go over business matters. That's when we'd make our move. But we couldn't just walk in the front door. This wasn't some backroom poker game, there were guards, lookouts, eyes everywhere. So we decided on the disguise, IRS agents. It was perfect, the one group of men even the mob wouldn't dare refuse entry to. We'd show up with fake papers, fake badges, a whole act that would drop his guard long enough for us to get in range. Bugsy grinned when I told him. I like it. Bureau boys. Gives us the element of surprise. He won't see it comin'. For days, I rehearsed the details in my head. How we'd walk in. Who would talk. Who would pull the trigger. We'd keep it calm, keep it polite right up until it wasn't. This wasn't about rage or making a statement, this was about precision. Still, there was a weight on my chest that wouldn't lift. I'd been in this life long enough to know that even the best laid plans could blow up in your face. And if this one did, there wouldn't be a second chance. It was all or nothing. The night before, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, the soft hum of New York in the background. Somewhere down the block, a phonograph played an old jazz record, the sound warping and fading in the summer air. I thought about every man who'd sat where I was now, thinking they were untouchable, only to end up with their names in the paper and their bodies in the ground. And then I thought about Maranzano, sitting in that office tomorrow, thinking he still held the crown. Thinking the game was still his. By the time the sun came up, my mind was made of steel. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was history in the making. Tomorrow, the old king would fall. The day came dressed in sunlight, the kind that makes the city look softer than it really is. Park Avenue was already busy, the hum of engines mixing with the sharp clack of shoes on the sidewalk. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, but on the surface, I was calm. That's the trick in this life, you never let them see the storm in you. Bugsy and I stepped out of the cab a block away from Maranzano's building. We wore dark suits, pressed to perfection, and carried thin leather briefcases. The badges in our inside pockets felt heavier than they should have. Not because of their weight, but because of what they meant. These weren't props for some cheap con, they were the keys to the last door standing between me and the top. The lobby smelled of marble polish and old cigars. The man behind the front desk barely looked up as we walked past, our shoes making quiet clicks on the floor. We didn't hurry. We didn't slow down. We moved like we belonged there, because in that moment, we did. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. Bugsy leaned against the wall, his eyes half-lidded but alert, like a wolf resting before the pounce. I kept my gaze fixed on the numbers lighting up above the door. 5, 6, 7, and then 8. The floor where the king waited. The hallway outside the elevator was carpeted, thick enough to swallow sound. 2 men stood outside Maranzano's office, not his usual muscle, but buttoned-up types who still had the eyes of street men. They straightened when we approached. "Afternoon, gentlemen," I said, pulling out the badge. My voice was smooth, just another day at the office. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have an appointment with Mr. Maranzano. One guard glanced at the badge, then at my face. His suspicion was there faint, but present. But he didn't have the authority to stop us, and he knew it. He stepped aside and opened the door. The office smelled like paper and pipe tobacco, the sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds in thin, dusty beams. Maranzano sat behind a massive desk, his posture rigid, his suit immaculate. He was older now, but his eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp that could slice a man to ribbons without a blade. "Gentlemen," he said, his Italian accent still thick despite the years in America. "To what do I owe this visit?" I set my briefcase on the edge of the desk, flipping it open just enough to show a stack of papers, fake ledgers, mock warrants, the whole performance. "Routine matter," I said. "Some questions about business dealings. Won't take long." He nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled. That was the moment, the crack in the armor. His guard dropped just a fraction, but enough. Bugsy moved first. In one fluid motion, the papers were forgotten and a pistol appeared in his hand. The sound in that office changed instantly, the hum of the city vanished, replaced by the quick, sharp gasp of the man behind the desk. Maranzano's mouth opened, maybe to yell, maybe to bargain, but he never got the chance. Bugsy fired once, twice, and the old man's body jerked against the chair. I stepped forward, taking the weapon from Bugsy and putting 2 more rounds in to be certain. No hesitation. No words. Just the final punctuation on a chapter that had been too long in the writing. For a moment, the room was still. Dust hung in the sunlight like tiny fragments of glass. I looked at him, the man who'd once claimed he ruled all of us, now nothing more than another name that would make headlines in the morning. Bugsy wiped his gun with a handkerchief, then handed it to me. "It's done," he said, his voice low but steady. We left the way we came, walking past the guards without a glance. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that its underworld had just shifted under its feet. In that moment, the commission was no longer a dream, it was inevitable. And I was the man who would sit at the head of the table. The rain had started by the time we reached Mulberry Street, a steady drizzle that made the asphalt shine like black glass. The city looked different that night, quieter, more watchful, as if it knew something had shifted in its bones. I could feel it too, deep down. Maranzano was gone, and the old rules had been buried with him. The meeting wasn't in some flashy joint or grand hall. That would have been asking for trouble. No, we chose a back room in an unassuming building, one of those places that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. The smell of damp wood and stale cigar smoke hung heavy in the air. It was neutral ground, and more importantly, it was my ground. One by one, they came in. The heads of the most powerful families in the city, each with their own shadows trailing behind them. Some were smooth talkers in fine suits, others still carried the street on their shoulders. But they all had one thing in common: they'd survived long enough to sit at this table. I watched them as they settled in, the scrape of chairs and the low murmur of greetings mixing with the occasional clink of glass. They were measuring me just as I was measuring them. Each man here had killed to get where he was, and each one was thinking about whether he'd have to do it again. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch, just enough to make them uneasy. Then I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice even, "the old ways are done. We've all seen what happens when one man tries to wear the crown. Maranzano. Masuria. They thought they could be kings. But kings make enemies. And enemies make funerals." A few of them nodded. Others kept their faces blank, but their eyes gave them away. They knew I was right, even if they didn't want to admit it. I laid it out for them, plain and simple. No more one-man rule. From now on, we'd have a commission, a table where every major family had a seat and every decision was made together. Disputes settled without bullets in the street. Business handled like businessmen, not street punks. "We'll still have our wars," I told them, "but they'll be quiet ones, the kind fought in whispers and deals instead of drive-bys. This isn't about friendship. It's about money. About power. We can all get rich, or we can all get dead. I don't care which, but I know which one makes more sense." There was a pause, the kind that feels like it could go either way. Then Albert Anastasia leaned back in his chair and gave the faintest smile. "I'll drink to that," he said, lifting his glass. It broke the tension. One by one, they agreed, some with enthusiasm, others with the weary acceptance of men who'd seen too much blood. The first commission was born that night, not with fanfare, but with the quiet clink of glasses and the soft rustle of men leaning back in their chairs, calculating their next move. I knew it wasn't peace. Not really. It was just a different kind of war, one fought with contracts instead of Tommy guns. But it was my war, on my terms. And for the first time, I wasn't just another player on the board. I was the one who built it. When the meeting broke, the rain had stopped. The streets were slick and empty, the city's heartbeat slow and steady again. I lit a cigarette and took a long drag, watching the smoke curl into the damp air. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of traffic, the occasional honk of a cab, the life of New York carrying on. The men who left that room would go back to their territories, their rackets, their crews. But they'd all remember this night. Because this was the night I stopped answering to anyone. The first test came sooner than I expected. It always does in this life. You think you've built something solid, and the street finds a way to shake it just to see if it falls. Word reached me that the Gagliano crew was having trouble with the Prophesy family over a piece of waterfront territory in Brooklyn. At first, it sounded small, a couple of trucks, a few stevedores switching loyalties. But in this business, small trouble has a way of growing teeth. By the time it landed on my desk, men had been beaten, warehouses torched, and whispers of a shooting were circling. Now, before the commission, that kind of dispute would have been handled the old-fashioned way: bullets in the night, bodies in the gutter, cops sniffing around, headlines screaming. But this was exactly why I'd built the commission, to keep the blood off the streets, at least in the open. I sent word to both sides. No soldiers. No guns. No games. Just the bosses, in my office on East 46th Street, the one above the tailor shop. A neutral spot, but everyone knew it was my ground. The room was quiet when they came in. Gagliano with his measured, almost polite manner, Prophesy with his oily smile and the eyes of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't waste time. Gentlemen, I said, leaning back in my chair, the dock belongs to whoever's making the most money for everybody at this table. That's how this works now. You got a problem with that, then you got a problem with me. Prophesy tried to play it smooth. Lucky, I've been running that dock for years. My men keep it moving like clockwork. These Gagliano boys are just looking to make trouble. Gagliano shook his head. That dock's been bleeding money for months. Half the cargo's disappearing before it hits the trucks. I've got men who can turn it around in a week. The old way would have been to pick a side and let the other man stew. But that would have meant taking on his enemies too. I wasn't in the business of making unnecessary enemies. So I did what a businessman does, I turned it into a deal. You're both wrong, I told them. The dock belongs to both of you now. You split it. Prophesy keeps his stevedores, Gagliano handles the shipments. Profits get reported to the commission, and if they drop, you both lose it. That way you're both watching each other, and neither of you's got a reason to start shooting. It was quiet for a moment. Prophesy didn't like it, but he could see it was better than losing the dock altogether. Gagliano didn't like it either, but he knew I'd just handed him a way in without a war. They shook hands, the kind of handshake that's more about keeping up appearances than trust. When they left, I lit a cigarette and sat back. The commission had worked. No blood. No cops. No papers. Just business. But there was something in Prophesy's eyes when he walked out. A flicker, like a man memorizing a slight to pay back later. That's the thing about peace in our world, it's just a pause between wars. And I knew then that my commission wasn't going to keep everyone happy. It was going to keep them in line until they thought they could push back. The first betrayal never comes from the outside. No, the first cut is always from someone close enough to know exactly where to stick the knife. That's the thing nobody tells you about building something big. The danger doesn't just walk through the front door, it comes from the chair right next to yours. It started with whispers, the kind that travel from barbacks to bookies to my ear like smoke finding a crack in the wall. Someone on the commission had been skimming. Not a lot, not enough to show up on the surface, but enough that the numbers didn't add up when I ran them in my head. And my head for numbers was something no one had ever doubted. At first, I didn't want to believe it. The commission was supposed to be untouchable, the one table where we all came as equals, where the rules kept the wolves from eating each other alive. But when you've lived as long as I had in this life, you learn that loyalty is just another word, and words are cheap. The trail led to Vito Genovese. Now, Vito and I went back years. We'd stood on the same street corners, run the same rackets, and taken the same risks. He was the kind of man who smiled while his brain was already figuring out how to own the room. But Vito had one flaw: his hunger was bigger than his patience. I didn't go to him right away. That's not how you handle a man like Vito. You watch him first. You let him think you don't see the game he's playing. Meanwhile, I admire Lansky, my numbers man, the guy who could smell a crooked ledger from a mile away, go through every shipment, every payout, every accidental miscalculation. The picture became clear: Vito had been rerouting shipments meant for the commission into his own warehouses, then selling the goods back through a shell operation. On paper, the numbers looked clean. In reality, he was bleeding the table and fattening his own pockets. One night, I called a meeting, not the full commission, just the core. It was in the back of a restaurant on Mulberry Street, where the light was low and the wine was strong. Vito came in smiling like a man walking into his own birthday party. I let him talk, let him tell a story about a union boss he'd just convinced to see things our way. When he finished, I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Vito," I said, slow and calm, "you think I don't know about the docs? You think I don't see the numbers? You've been taking from all of us. That's not just business, that's betrayal." For a moment, the whole table went quiet. You could hear the ice settling in the glasses. Vito's smile didn't break, but his eyes, they got colder. "Lucky," he said, "I've been making moves for the good of the family." I shook my head. "No. You've been making moves for Vito. And there's no room for that here." It could have gone either way right there. If he'd pushed, if he'd called my bluff, maybe the bullets would have flown before dessert hit the table. But Vito was smart, too smart to go to war in that moment. He leaned back, raised his hands just enough to show he wasn't reaching for steel. "All right," he said. "You want it back, you got it back." We ended the night with a drink, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. You don't humiliate a man like Vito in front of others without planting a seed. And that seed would grow into something dangerous, something I'd have to face sooner or later. Because in this world, forgiveness is just a mask you wear until the knife's ready to slide between the ribs. And Vito Genovese? He'd just started sharpening his. Now, headlines like that weren't new. Politicians love to talk tough before an election, and most of the time those words were just smoke. But this time, something felt different. I could smell it before it even hit the wind, the scent of a real move being made. Word started filtering in from my people at the courthouse. The U.S. Attorney's Office had gotten fresh funding, new prosecutors, and a mandate straight from Washington. And at the center of it all was a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. He was clean, stubborn, and worst of all, he actually believed in the law. That made him dangerous. You can buy a crooked man. You can threaten him. But a man with principles? That's a different animal entirely. At first, we tried the usual, softening him up. We had a couple of friendly politicians pay him a visit, slide some offers across his desk, the kind that usually make a man rethink his career path. But Dewey wasn't taking the bait. The man didn't just shut the door, he slammed it. That's when I knew this was gonna be a fight, not a conversation. Dewey had already started lining up witnesses, pulling in small-time operators, squeezing them until their loyalty cracked. Some of them were nothing, street-level guys who couldn't find their way out of a paper bag. But others? They knew things. Things about me, about the commission, about the delicate web we'd built to keep the peace and the profits flowing. I called a quiet meeting in a suite at the Waldorf, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, a couple of the bosses who still owed me favors. We went over names, cases, every possible angle. The mood was tense, not scared, but sharp, like a knife edge. Everyone understood the same thing: if Dewey got even one real charge to stick, the whole operation could unravel. Bribes aren't gonna work, Meyer said, leaning over the table. So we go the other way: influence. We get the unions talking about how Dewey's cracking down on jobs. We get the papers to paint him as a man who doesn't understand the city. It was a good plan, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. We also had to get to the witnesses before Dewey did. That meant money in some pockets, vacations for some families, and for the ones who wouldn't play ball, well, we had other ways of keeping mouths shut. The trick was moving fast without looking desperate. Every bribe, every threat, every accident had to be done in a way that left no trail back to me. That's where Frank Costello's gift came in. The man could make a problem disappear with nothing but a phone call and a smile. Weeks passed like that, constant pressure, constant maneuvering. Dewey kept pushing, and we kept pushing back. The city was like a chessboard, where every pawn was ready to turn into a queen if you moved it right. But the truth was, for all our moves, Dewey was still out there, building his case. And every night, when the streets got quiet and the noise of the day faded, I'd sit by the window with a glass in my hand and think about the real danger. It wasn't the raids, or the headlines, or even the witnesses. It was the idea that, for the first time in years, somebody out there wasn't afraid of us. Fear, that was our currency. Lose it, and everything else starts to slip away. And if Thomas Dewey took that from us? We'd be finished long before the trial ever started.